The moment my sister Cassandra raised her hand at Union Central Station, I knew our relationship had reached a point of no return. The sharp crack of her palm against my cheek echoed through the bustling terminal, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze around us. Commuters paused mid-step, their eyes drawn to the spectacle of two women in what appeared to be a family dispute. But what Cassandra didn't know, what none of them knew, was that beneath my simple civilian clothes and weary travel appearance, I carried a secret that would change everything in the next few minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "How dare you embarrass me like this, Rachel?" she hissed, her voice carrying that familiar tone of superiority I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What this could cost me?" I touched my stinging cheek, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle over me like an old, worn coat. This was supposed to be a celebration, a homecoming after months away. Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of Northbridge's busiest transportation hub, publicly humiliated by the sister I'd traveled across 3 states to surprise. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just 48 hours earlier, I'd been standing on the bridge of the USS Meridian, accepting congratulations from my crew after receiving the most significant promotion of my naval career. The ceremony had been held at the Clearwater Naval Base, where Admiral Patricia Hawthorne herself had pinned the new insignia to my uniform while hundreds of officers stood at attention. 23 years of service, countless deployments, and more sacrifices than I cared to count had all led to that moment. But here, in civilian clothes, with my hair down and exhaustion written across my face from the long journey home, I was just Rachel Montgomery, Cassandra's younger sister, the one who never quite lived up to her potential, as she'd often reminded me throughout our adult years. "You specifically told me not to come," Cassandra continued, her voice dropping to an angry whisper as she glanced around nervously at the gathering crowd. "The Henderson promotion party is tonight, and I cannot have you showing up looking like this." She gestured dismissively at my simple jeans and navy blue sweater. The same outfit I'd thrown on hastily after my red-eye flight from San Diego was delayed by 6 hours. Cassandra had always been the golden child in our family. At 35, she was 2 years older than me and never let me forget it. She'd married well. Jonathan Henderson came from old Northbridge money and had recently been promoted to deputy chief of the city's police department. Cassandra managed his career with the same meticulous attention she applied to everything else in her perfectly curated life. Their house in Elwood Heights was featured in the local lifestyle magazine last spring. She chaired 3 different charity committees and had her sights on the mayor's wife's inner circle. And then there was me, the sister who'd run away to the military right after high school instead of attending Whitmore University like a proper Montgomery daughter should. The one who sent postcards from exotic ports but never seemed to have time for extended family visits. The one who missed Cassandra's wedding because I was deployed in the Mediterranean, missed her husband's police academy graduation because I was stationed in Japan, and missed countless birthdays and holidays because duty called. From Cassandra's perspective, I was the family disappointment who chose adventure over responsibility, freedom over commitment. She saw my military service as an extended phase, something I'd eventually grow out of when I realized what I was missing in the real world. She had no idea that I'd built a distinguished career, that my name was known and respected in naval circles around the globe, and that the president himself had been briefed on several operations I'd commanded. "You could have at least called first," she said, her tone shifting from anger to the condescending patience she used when she thought she was being reasonable. "I specifically would have explained why this weekend isn't good for one of your surprise visits." One of my surprise visits, as if my rare trips home were inconvenient intrusions rather than genuine attempts to maintain our family bond. I'd driven straight from Clearwater to the airport, caught the first available flight, endured delays and cancellations just to be here for what I'd hoped would be a genuine reunion. I'd even planned to share my news, to finally help her understand what I'd been building all these years away from Northbridge. The crowd around us was growing thicker, though most people were pretending not to stare while obviously listening to every word. I noticed a young man in military dress blues standing near the information booth, his eyes sharp and attentive in the way that marked him as active duty. Something in his posture suggested he was trying to place me, though I couldn't imagine how we might know each other. "Cassandra," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice level despite the burning in my chest. "I didn't come here to cause problems. I came because I have news to share. Good news. I thought you'd want to celebrate."
Celebrate what? She interrupted, her laugh sharp and bitter. Another promotion to some middle management position on a boat somewhere? Rachel, when are you going to understand that real success looks different than whatever fantasy you've built up about your little military career? Her words hit harder than her slap had. Little military career. As if commanding a guided missile destroyer, as if leading humanitarian missions in disaster zones, as if earning the respect of admirals and foreign dignitaries was somehow less meaningful than organizing charity luncheons and managing a police deputy's social calendar. I felt something shift inside me. The same feeling I'd experienced years ago during my first command, when I'd realized that respect had to be demanded, not requested. The same steel that had carried me through storm-tossed seas and diplomatic crises began to surface now, here in this civilian setting where I'd always defaulted to being Cassandra's accommodating younger sister. "You know what, Cassandra?" I said, my voice gaining strength with each word. "You're absolutely right. This was a mistake." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as I turned to walk away, I heard footsteps approaching rapidly from behind. The young officer I'd noticed earlier was moving toward us with purpose, his expression shifting from uncertainty to recognition to something approaching alarm. And in that moment, I realized that my carefully maintained separation between my military and civilian lives was about to come crashing down in the most unexpected way possible. What happened next would change not only how Cassandra saw me, but how she saw herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sting of Cassandra's slap was still fresh on my cheek as I tried to process what had just happened. 20 minutes earlier, I'd stepped off the train from Clearwater with genuine excitement, my heart full of the news I couldn't wait to share. Now I stood in the middle of Union Central Station, publicly humiliated by the sister I'd traveled 800 miles to surprise. "Look at you," Cassandra continued, her voice dripping with the familiar condescension that had defined our relationship since childhood. "Wrinkled clothes, no makeup, hair like you've been sleeping in airports. Do you have any idea how this reflects on me, on Jonathan's career?" I watched as she smoothed down her perfectly pressed blazer and adjusted her pearl necklace, the one Jonathan had given her for their 5th anniversary, which she wore like a badge of her superior life choices. Everything about Cassandra was calculated for maximum social impact. Her honey blonde hair lights touched up religiously every 6 weeks, her designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her manicured nails that had never known a day of real work. "I came straight from the base," I said quietly, though I knew explanations were pointless with Cassandra. "My flight was delayed and I thought—" "You thought wrong," she snapped. "Tonight is Jonathan's promotion celebration at the Northbridge Country Club. The mayor will be there, the city council, everyone who matters in this town. And you want to show up looking like some vagrant who just rolled off a freight train?" The comparison stung, but what hurt more was the familiar pattern. This was exactly how it had always been between us, even as children growing up in our parents' modest house on Maple Avenue. Cassandra had been the perfect daughter, student council president, homecoming queen, full scholarship to Whitmore University. She dated the captain of the football team, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in political science, and immediately set about marrying the most promising young man she could find. I, on the other hand, had been the restless one. While Cassandra was winning debate tournaments and organizing charity drives, I was reading military history and dreaming of adventures beyond Northbridge's carefully manicured borders. Our parents, Thomas and Eleanor Montgomery, had never hidden their preference. Cassandra was their pride and joy, the daughter who would make something of herself. I was their worry, the wild card who needed guidance and direction. Rachel has such potential, our mother used to say with that particular sigh reserved for disappointing children. If only she would apply herself the way Cassandra does. When I announced my intention to join the Navy immediately after high school, the family reaction was predictable. Cassandra called it running away from responsibility. Our father worried about me wasting my mind on manual labor. Our mother cried for 3 days straight, convinced I was throwing my life away on some misguided notion of adventure. Only our grandfather, retired Army Colonel William Montgomery, had supported my decision. He'd served in Korea and Vietnam, and he understood the calling that Cassandra and my parents couldn't see. But he passed away during my third deployment, and with him went the only family member who'd ever seen my military service as something more than an extended rebellion against conventional success. Do you remember what you said at my high school graduation? I asked Cassandra now, the memory suddenly sharp and painful. You told everyone at the party that I was taking the easy way out because I couldn't handle real college.
Cassandra's jaw tightened. You could have had a full ride to Whitmore, too. Your SAT scores were almost as good as mine. Instead, you chose to waste that potential playing soldier. Plain soldier. Even now, after 17 years of active duty, she still saw my career as an elaborate game, a phase I'd never outgrown. She had no idea that I'd graduated top of my class from the Naval Academy after earning my commission through Officer Candidate School. She didn't know about the Advanced War College, the multiple graduate degrees I'd earned during shore assignments, or the commendations that filled a locked cabinet in my quarters aboard the Meridian. To Cassandra, I was still the impulsive 18-year-old who'd chosen adventure over stability, who disappointed our parents and embarrassed the family name by refusing to follow the prescribed path of marriage, children, and social climbing in Northbridge's established hierarchy. The Hendersons have been nothing but gracious about your career choice, she continued, her tone suggesting she considered this remarkable generosity on their part. Jonathan's father even mentioned you at the Rotary Club last year, talking about how proud he is to have a military sister-in-law, even if you've never been around to contribute anything meaningful to the family. The casual cruelty of that statement, even if you've never been around to contribute anything meaningful, hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the money I'd quietly sent when Jonathan was still working his way up through the police ranks and they were struggling to make mortgage payments on their house in Elmwood Heights. I thought about the care packages I'd arranged to be sent during Cassandra's difficult pregnancy with their son Marcus when I was deployed in the South China Sea but still wanted to show support. I thought about the times I'd called from foreign ports just to check in, only to be told that Cassandra was too busy with real responsibilities to talk to her sister who was playing around on boats somewhere. I thought about the birthday and Christmas gifts I'd carefully selected and shipped from wherever I was stationed, gifts that were acknowledged with perfunctory thank you texts if they were acknowledged at all. You know what your problem is, Rachel? Cassandra said, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she'd perfected during her brief stint as a high school debate coach before marrying Jonathan. You've never learned to prioritize what actually matters. Family, community, building something real instead of chasing fantasies around the world. A businessman in an expensive suit paused nearby, pretending to check his phone while obviously listening to our conversation. 2 college students had stopped to stare openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to secondhand embarrassment. Even the janitor mopping floors in the corner kept glancing our way, drawn to the drama unfolding in his workspace. I felt the familiar weight of shame that Cassandra had always been able to invoke, the feeling that somehow my choices that had brought me satisfaction, purpose, and yes, considerable professional success, were fundamentally selfish and wrong. For a moment, I was 18 again, standing in our parents' living room while Cassandra explained to relatives why her younger sister was going through a rebellious phase instead of accepting her place in Northbridge's society. But then I remembered something Admiral Hawthorne had said during my promotion ceremony just 2 days ago. Commander Montgomery, you spent your career proving that service and sacrifice are their own rewards. Never let anyone convince you that what you've built is anything less than extraordinary. The weight of the new insignia in my travel bag seemed to pulse with significance. 3 silver stars that represented not just a promotion, but recognition of leadership,
competence, and dedication at the highest levels of naval command. Recognition that had come from people who understood the true meaning of service, not from a sister who measured worth by social connections and zip codes. "I should go," I said finally, hefting my duffel bag and turning toward the exit. "You're right, Cassandra. This was a mistake." But as I took my first step away from her, I heard a sharp voice call out from across the terminal. "Excuse me. Ma'am, excuse me." The young officer I'd noticed earlier was striding toward us with increasing urgency, his dress blues immaculate and his expression shifting from uncertainty to something approaching recognition. Behind him, I could see other travelers beginning to take notice, including a small group of what appeared to be military personnel in civilian clothes, their posture and bearing unmistakable even without uniforms. Cassandra turned to see what was happening, irritation flickering across her face at this new interruption to what she clearly considered a private family matter. But something in the young man's approach, the purposefulness of his stride, the way he seemed to be looking directly at me rather than around me, suggested this was about to become anything but private. And in that moment, I realized that the careful separation I'd maintained between my military life and my family life was about to come crashing down in the most public way possible. The young officer approaching us was Lieutenant Commander James Reeves, though I didn't recognize him immediately in the chaos of the moment. What I did recognize was the look of dawning realization on his face, the same expression I'd seen countless times when junior officers suddenly understood they were in the presence of someone far above their pay grade.
My mind raced back to 3 months ago, when I'd been conducting surprise inspections at Naval Station Norfolk. Reeves had been among a group of promising young officers selected for an advanced tactical training program I'd personally designed. He'd stood out not just for his sharp questions about modern naval warfare, but for his genuine curiosity about leadership under pressure. I'd spent nearly an hour after the formal session answering his questions about command decision-making in hostile waters. But that had been Admiral Rachel Montgomery, in full dress uniform, with my insignia clearly visible and my authority unquestionable. The woman standing in Union Central Station was just Rachel, tired, disheveled, and apparently deserving of public humiliation from her older sister. The secret I'd been carrying felt heavier with each step Reeves took toward us. 2 days ago, I'd stood in the main conference room at Clearwater Naval Base, surrounded by the highest-ranking officers in the Atlantic Fleet. Admiral Patricia Hawthorne, a woman whose reputation was legendary throughout the Navy, had personally conducted the ceremony that changed everything. "Commander Montgomery," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of naval tradition, "your service record speaks to a level of excellence that exemplifies the very best of our maritime heritage. Your leadership during Operation Midnight Current prevented an international incident that could have destabilized the entire Mediterranean region. Your innovative approaches to joint task force coordination have become standard training protocol at the Naval War College." The promotion had been years in the making, the culmination of missions I could never fully discuss with civilians, decisions that had kept American interests secure in waters from the Arctic Circle to the Horn of Africa. I'd commanded destroyers through storm systems that would have broken lesser vessels. I'd navigated delicate diplomatic situations in foreign ports where one wrong word could have sparked international incidents. Just last year, I'd led a humanitarian mission to the Philippines following a devastating typhoon, coordinating with multiple international navies to deliver critical supplies to isolated island communities. The operation had saved thousands of lives and earned commendations from 5 different governments. But it had also meant missing Cassandra's birthday party, which she'd held at the Northbridge Country Club with all the social fanfare she could muster. "Where were you when it mattered, Rachel?" she'd asked during our last phone conversation. "Marcus asked why his aunt never comes to important family events. What was I supposed to tell him?" What she'd told him, I'd learned later from our cousin, was that Aunt Rachel was too busy playing with boats to care about family occasions. The casual dismissal of my responsibilities that included ensuring safe passage for merchant vessels through pirate-infested waters off Somalia, had stung more than I'd admitted even to myself. The irony was that everything I'd built in my naval career had been motivated, at least initially, by a desire to make my family proud. I'd wanted to prove that the restless girl who'd chosen military service over conventional success could achieve something meaningful. I'd imagined someday returning to Northbridge with stories that would finally earn their respect, accomplishments that would validate the path I'd chosen despite their disapproval. Instead, I'd learned to find validation elsewhere, from the crews who'd served under my command, from the admirals who'd entrusted me with increasingly complex missions, from the foreign naval officers who'd worked alongside me and seen firsthand what American naval leadership looked like at its finest. My personal quarters aboard the USS Meridian contained letters of commendation from 3 different presidents, photographs with heads of state from a dozen nations, and medals that represented everything from combat valor to humanitarian service. But none of it mattered here in Northbridge, where success was measured by property values and social connections rather than lives saved or international crises averted. The promotion to Admiral had been the culmination of everything I'd worked toward since leaving home at 18. Only 12% of naval officers ever reach flag rank, and less than 3% of those are women. Admiral Hawthorne had made a point of emphasizing this during the ceremony, noting that my advancement represented not just personal achievement, but progress for women throughout the maritime services. You've shattered glass ceilings in ways that will benefit generations of female officers who follow in your wake, she had told me privately after the formal proceedings. But standing here in the train station, still feeling the sting of Cassandra's hand on my cheek, I might as well have been the wayward teenager she still saw when she looked at me. The 3 stars that would soon adorn my new uniform meant nothing to a sister who never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living. I'd planned this surprise visit carefully, timing it to coincide with Jonathan's promotion celebration. Not because I wanted to overshadow his achievement, but because I'd hoped to finally bridge the gap between my military world and my family world. I'd wanted to share my news in person, to see genuine pride in Cassandra's eyes for the first time since we were children. Instead, I'd walked into the same old dynamic that had defined our relationship for 17 years. I was still the irresponsible younger sister who made choices that embarrassed the family, still the disappointment who prioritized adventure over stability, still the woman who played soldier instead of embracing real adult responsibilities like marriage and motherhood.
Lieutenant Commander Reeves was getting closer now, and I could see the exact moment when recognition fully dawned. His eyes widened slightly, and his pace quickened with the urgency of someone who just realized they were witnessing something significant. Behind him, the group of military personnel I'd noticed earlier were beginning to move in our direction, their trained eyes picking up on the signals that civilians would miss. Cassandra was still talking, her voice rising with the kind of indignation she reserved for moments when she felt her social standing was threatened. I don't know who that young man thinks he is, but I'm having a private conversation with my sister. The absolute nerve of some people, inserting themselves into family business. Family business. As if my career, my achievements, my entire adult life were somehow separate from who I really was. As if the woman who'd earned the respect of foreign admirals and commanded vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars was just a role I played, rather than the person I'd become through years of dedication and sacrifice. But Lieutenant Commander Reeves was less than 20 feet away now, and the expression on his face suggested that this carefully maintained separation between my 2 worlds was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. The weight of my new rank, a rank that would soon be common knowledge throughout the naval community, pressed against my consciousness like a physical presence. In less than a minute, everything Cassandra thought she knew about her disappointing younger sister was about to change forever. Lieutenant Commander Reeves came to a crisp halt 3 feet from where Cassandra and I stood, his military bearing unmistakable even to the civilians gathering around us. His salute was textbook perfect, shoulders square, eyes forward, hand positioned exactly as prescribed in naval regulations. But it was the words that followed that turned my world upside down in the most public way imaginable. "Admiral Montgomery," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal's marble floors. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves, ma'am. We served together during the Norfolk Tactical Training Exercise 3 months ago. I apologize for the interruption, but I wanted to express my congratulations on your recent promotion." The silence that followed was deafening.
I watched Cassandra's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching shock as she processed what she'd just heard. Around us, conversations stopped mid-sentence as travelers turned to stare at the unfolding scene. Someone's coffee cup clattered to the floor, forgotten in the sudden drama of the moment. "Admiral!" Cassandra's voice was barely above a whisper, her usual commanding tone completely absent. She looked at me as if seeing a stranger, her perfectly composed features slack with incomprehension. "Rachel, what is he talking about? What promotion?" But before I could respond, the situation spiraled completely beyond my control. The group of military personnel I'd noticed earlier had approached during Reeves' announcement, and I recognized several faces from various joint operations and training exercises over the years. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen stepped forward, her civilian clothes unable to disguise 23 years of naval service. "Ma'am," Chen said, addressing me with the kind of respect that comes from shared experience in dangerous waters. "The crew from the Henderson wanted me to pass along their congratulations. Word of your promotion has been circulating through the fleet since yesterday. They're proud to have served under your command during the Strait of Hormuz operation." More heads turned. The Strait of Hormuz operation had been classified, but the general fact of American naval presence in those contested waters was common knowledge among military families. What civilians didn't know was that I'd commanded a task force of 6 vessels through one of the most dangerous maritime choke points in the world, successfully deterring Iranian aggression while keeping international shipping lanes open. Cassandra's perfectly manicured hand went to her throat, clutching her pearl necklace like a lifeline. "Rachel, I don't understand what's happening here. These people seem to think you're some kind of admiral," I finished quietly, the weight of the words settling over our family dynamic like a heavy blanket. "Yes, as of 2 days ago, that's what I came to tell you." The crowd around us was growing larger, drawn by the spectacle of what appeared to be a military ceremony taking place in the middle of a civilian train station. I noticed several people holding up phones, undoubtedly recording what they assumed was some kind of homecoming surprise. If only they knew the real story, that this wasn't a planned celebration, but an accidental revelation that was dismantling 17 years of family assumptions in real time. Jonathan Henderson chose that exact moment to appear, having apparently received Cassandra's earlier text about picking me up from the station. Northbridge's newly promoted deputy police chief strode through the terminal with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His uniform was immaculate, his brass polished to mirror brightness, his expression carrying the self-satisfied air of a man celebrating his recent advancement in the city's power structure. "Cassandra, what's all this commotion about?" Jonathan's words died in his throat as he took in the scene. His eyes swept from the uniformed naval officer standing at attention, to the growing crowd of onlookers, to his wife's stunned expression, and finally to me. "Rachel, what's going on here?" Before anyone could answer, another voice cut through the noise of the terminal. "Well, I'll be damned. Is that Admiral Montgomery?" The speaker was Captain Robert Walsh, a career officer I'd worked with during the Mediterranean crisis 2 years earlier. He was in civilian clothes, apparently traveling through Northbridge on leave, but his recognition of me sent another ripple of whispers through the gathered crowd. Walsh approached with the easy confidence of someone who'd earned his rank through decades of competent service. "Ma'am, I heard through channels about your promotion," Walsh said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Long overdue, if you ask me. The Pacific Fleet's gain is the Atlantic's loss. When do you take command of your new assignment?" 3 weeks, I found myself answering automatically, though the surreal nature of this conversation in front of my sister and brother-in-law made every word feel like it was coming from someone else. "I'll be overseeing joint naval operations in the Western Pacific." Walsh nodded approvingly. "Significant responsibilities, especially given the current geopolitical climate. The Navy couldn't have chosen better." I glanced at Cassandra, watching her face as the full scope of what she was hearing began to sink in. Joint naval operations in the Western Pacific wasn't a desk job or some ceremonial position. It was one of the most strategically important commands in the modern Navy, involving coordination with allied fleets from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. It was the kind of assignment that required absolute trust from the Pentagon and represented recognition as one of the Navy's most capable flag officers. Jonathan, meanwhile, was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between confusion and what might have been the beginning of respect. As a police deputy chief, he understood hierarchical structures and the significance of rank. He was processing the fact that his sister-in-law, the woman his wife had just publicly slapped for embarrassing the family, outranked him by such a wide margin that they weren't even operating in the same universe of authority and responsibility. "Admiral Montgomery," Jonathan said finally, his voice carrying a formality that had never existed in our previous interactions. "I had no idea. Cassandra never mentioned that you'd achieved such a high rank." The accusation in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. He was beginning to understand that his wife had either been deliberately hiding information about my career or had been genuinely ignorant of my achievements. Either possibility reflected poorly on Cassandra's credibility and, by extension, on the family dynamics he'd accepted without question for years. Master Chief Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, if this is a bad time, we can certainly—" "No," I said, finding my voice at last. The initial shock of having my two worlds collide so dramatically was giving way to something else, a strange sense of liberation. For 17 years, I'd compartmentalized my life, keeping my family separate from my professional achievements, partly out of humility and partly out of a desire to avoid exactly this kind of scene. But now that the secret was out, I found myself oddly relieved. "Master Chief Chen, Captain Walsh, Lieutenant Commander Reeves, I appreciate your congratulations and your service. It's always an honor to encounter fellow naval personnel, even in unexpected circumstances." The formality of my response seemed to underscore the gulf between who I was in my professional life and who my family thought I was. Cassandra was staring at me as if I'd transformed into a completely different person before her eyes, which, in a way, I had. The Rachel she knew, the disappointing younger sister who'd never lived up to her potential, had never really existed, at least not for 17 years. But the woman who commanded the respect of seasoned naval officers, who'd earned the trust of admirals and foreign dignitaries, who'd been personally selected by the Pentagon for one of the Navy's most crucial assignments, that woman had been real all along, invisible to a family that never bothered to look beyond their own assumptions. The crowd around us continued to grow, drawn by the drama and the growing realization that something significant was unfolding. Several more military personnel had approached, creating what was beginning to resemble an impromptu honor guard in the middle of Union Central Station. And at the center of it all stood Cassandra, her hand still touching the cheek she'd struck less than 10 minutes earlier, beginning to understand that the sister she'd just publicly humiliated was someone she'd never known at all.
"Admiral Montgomery," Torres said, her smile genuine and warm. "I should have known you'd make flag rank eventually. After what you pulled off during Operation Neptune's Shield, it was just a matter of time." Operation Neptune's Shield. Even hearing the name brought back memories I rarely allowed myself to revisit. 72 hours of coordinated naval operations that had successfully extracted American civilians from a war-torn region while maintaining plausible deniability for political reasons. It had required split-second decision-making, perfect coordination with intelligence agencies, and the kind of leadership that either saves lives or costs careers. Cassandra was listening to every word, her face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. The confident superiority that had defined our relationship for decades was crumbling in real time, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like awe mixed with growing humiliation. She kept glancing between me and the uniformed officers treating me with obvious deference, as if trying to reconcile this reality with the sister she thought she knew. "Ma'am," Torres said, lowering her voice slightly,
I heard through channels about the Pacific assignment. Given the current tensions with China's naval expansion, that's going to be one of the most critical commands in the fleet. The Pentagon obviously has complete confidence in your capabilities. The current tensions with China's naval expansion. I could see Cassandra processing this phrase, beginning to understand that my new assignment wasn't some administrative position or ceremonial role. The Western Pacific Command involved overseeing operations in some of the most strategically important and potentially dangerous waters in the world, where American naval presence served as a deterrent to aggressive expansion by rival powers. Jonathan was standing slightly behind his wife now, and I could see him mentally recalibrating everything he thought he knew about his extended family. As deputy police chief of Northbridge, he commanded perhaps 200 officers and a city of 40,000 people. He was undoubtedly proud of his position, and rightfully so. It represented years of dedicated service and community leadership. But the woman he'd just watched his wife publicly humiliate commanded the respect of officers who oversaw operations involving tens of thousands of personnel and equipment worth billions of dollars. The scope difference was so vast it might as well have been measured in different units entirely. "Rachel," Cassandra said suddenly, her voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "I think we need to talk. Privately." But privacy was no longer an option. The crowd around us had grown to include not just military personnel, but curious civilians drawn by the spectacle of what appeared to be an important military figure being honored in an unexpected location. Several people were openly recording with their phones now, undoubtedly planning to post videos of what they assumed was a heartwarming homecoming story. If only they knew the real story. That this wasn't a planned celebration, but the accidental destruction of 17 years of family misconceptions. Master Chief Petty Officer David Kim stepped forward, his dress blues marking him as someone traveling on official business. I recognized him from the joint exercises we conducted with South Korean naval forces last year, operations that had strengthened Allied cooperation in response to increasing North Korean maritime provocations. "Ma'am," Kim said, his tone carrying the respectful formality that senior enlisted personnel used when addressing flag officers. "I wanted to pass along congratulations from the crew of the USS Columbia. They're still talking about your leadership during the Yellow Sea incidents. Your tactical decisions probably prevented a significant international escalation." The Yellow Sea incidents, another classified operation that Cassandra would never fully understand, but the mention of preventing international escalation carried weight even for civilians. She was beginning to grasp that my career hadn't been spent playing soldier or sailing around on boats, but handling crises that could have drawn the United States into major conflicts. "Admiral," a new voice called out, and I turned to see Commander Lisa Park approaching with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to important responsibilities. Park commanded a guided missile cruiser based out of San Diego, and we'd worked together during the recent freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to thank you personally for the tactical recommendations you provided during the Spratly Island situation. Your insights probably saved American lives and definitely prevented a diplomatic crisis." The Spratly Island situation, another classified operation that Cassandra would never fully understand, but the mention of preventing international conflict carried weight even for civilians. She was beginning to grasp that my career hadn't been spent playing soldier or sailing around on boats, but handling crises that had to be managed perfectly. "I had no idea," Cassandra whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I had absolutely no idea."
The admission hung in the air between us like a physical presence. No idea about the sleepless nights spent coordinating multinational naval operations. No idea about the weight of command decisions that affected thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. No idea about the phone calls from Pentagon officials seeking my input on strategic naval deployments. No idea that the sister she just slapped in public was considered one of the Navy's most capable flag officers, trusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond anything she'd ever imagined. But the moment that truly shattered what remained of our old family dynamic came when Captain Walsh received a phone call. I could hear only his side of the conversation, but his increasingly formal tone suggested he was speaking with someone of considerable authority. "Yes, sir," Walsh said, his voice carrying across the now quiet terminal. "Yes, sir, she's here.
I'll pass along your congratulations personally." He ended the call and turned to me with an expression that bordered on reverence. "Ma'am, that was Admiral Harrison at the Pentagon. Apparently, word of your location has reached some very high levels. He wanted me to convey his personal congratulations and to remind you that your security briefing is scheduled for Monday morning." Security briefing at the Pentagon. The implications of that phrase weren't lost on anyone present, military or civilian. Jonathan's face had gone completely pale, and Cassandra looked as if she might be physically sick. "Admiral Harrison?" Torres asked with obvious respect. "The Chief of Naval Operations?" "The same," Walsh confirmed. "Apparently, Admiral Montgomery's new assignment involves briefing levels that require direct coordination with the Pentagon's senior staff." The Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense and ultimately to the President himself. The fact that I had a personal relationship with someone at that level of authority was beginning to sink in for everyone present. But it was Cassandra's reaction that cut deepest. She was staring at me with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and what I was beginning to recognize as genuine fear. Fear that she'd just publicly assaulted someone whose importance extended far beyond family dynamics. Fear that her actions might have consequences she'd never considered. Fear that everything she thought she knew about the place in the world had just been fundamentally challenged. The breaking point had arrived, and there was no going back to the comfortable assumptions that had defined our relationship for nearly 2 decades. The weight of what had just happened was settling over me like a heavy cloak. But instead of the shame I'd expected to feel from such a public family confrontation, something entirely different was taking root. For 17 years, I'd allowed my family to see me as they chose to see me, the wayward daughter who'd never quite lived up to her potential. I'd enabled their misconceptions through silence, through modest deflections of my achievements, through a misguided desire to keep peace rather than demand recognition. But standing in Union Central Station, surrounded by officers who understood exactly what my career represented, I felt something I hadn't experienced in my family's presence since childhood: genuine pride in who I'd become. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the tone of command that had become second nature over the years, "I appreciate all of your congratulations and support. However, this is a family matter, and I think it's time we allowed normal station operations to resume." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, though many of the military personnel lingered nearby, clearly interested in the outcome of what they'd witnessed. Captain Walsh approached me one final time, his expression serious. "Ma'am, if there's anything you need, transportation, accommodation, anything at all, you have my contact information. The Navy takes care of its own, especially at your level of command." The implication was clear and unmistakable. If my family situation had become untenable, I had options that extended far beyond the limited world of Northbridge social dynamics. I had a community of professional peers who understood my value and would provide support without question. Cassandra caught the exchange, her face flushing with what I was beginning to recognize as genuine mortification. She was finally understanding the scope of what she'd done, not just slapping her sister in public, but assaulting a flag officer whose security clearance probably exceeded that of most federal officials. "Rachel, we really need to talk, please." Jonathan was standing slightly apart from us now, his police training evident in the way he was assessing the situation from multiple angles. As a law enforcement officer, he understood hierarchies of authority and the serious implications of what he'd just witnessed. His wife had committed assault against someone whose security clearance probably exceeded that of most federal officials. "Perhaps," I said, shouldering my duffel bag with movements that felt more decisive than they had in years, "we should discuss this somewhere more private. Though I should mention that my time in Northbridge is limited. I have obligations that require my attention."
The simple statement carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on either of them. I wasn't the unemployed younger sister with nothing but time on her hands. I had responsibilities that extended far beyond family drama, commitments that couldn't be postponed for the convenience of people who'd never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living. We walked toward the parking garage in silence, though I noticed that Cassandra kept glancing at me sideways, as if seeing me for the first time. The confident, condescending tone that had characterized her treatment of me for decades was completely absent, replaced by an uncertainty that seemed to shake her fundamental understanding of our family dynamic. Jonathan's police cruiser was parked in a reserved space marked for official vehicles. Under normal circumstances, I might have made a polite comment about the privilege of rank. Now, given what had just transpired, the irony of riding in a deputy police chief's vehicle felt almost absurd. I outranked him by so many levels of authority that we weren't even operating in the same sphere of governmental responsibility. The drive to their house in Elmwood Heights passed an uncomfortable silence. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of my childhood, noting the changes that 17 years of sporadic visits had allowed me to observe only in fragments. New shopping centers, updated traffic patterns, the gradual gentrification of neighborhoods that had been working class when we were growing up. But what struck me most was how small everything looked. Not physically smaller, the same streets, the same distances between landmarks, but somehow diminished in importance. These had been the boundaries of my world once, the geographic limits that defined success and failure, social standing and respectability. Now they felt like stage sets from a play I'd once performed in but had long since outgrown. Cassandra's house had always intimidated me during previous visits, a symbol of the conventional success that I'd supposedly failed to achieve. The perfectly manicured lawn, the elegant colonial architecture, the luxury vehicles in the circular driveway, all markers of the kind of respectable prosperity that our parents had wanted for both their daughters. But as we pulled into the driveway, I found myself assessing the property with different eyes. The house was lovely, certainly, but it represented a very localized version of success. My quarters aboard the USS Meridian might have been smaller, but they'd been my home while patrolling waters from the Arctic Circle to the Strait of Hormuz. I'd conducted video conferences with heads of state from that modest cabin, made decisions that affected international shipping lanes worth trillions of dollars annually. The contrast wasn't lost on me, and apparently it wasn't lost on Jonathan either. As we walked toward his front door, he paused and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been approaching respect. "Rachel," he said, using my name with a formality that had never existed in our previous interactions, "I owe you an apology. We both do. I had no idea about your achievements, your rank, your responsibilities. That's no excuse for how you've been treated, especially today." The apology surprised me, coming from Jonathan rather than from Cassandra, who remained silent as she unlocked the front door. But it also highlighted something that had been bothering me throughout this entire confrontation: the assumption that my rank and achievements were what made the disrespect unacceptable. "Jonathan," I said, pausing on their front porch, "I appreciate that sentiment, but here's what troubles me about it. Would my treatment have been acceptable if I'd remained a junior officer? If I'd never been promoted beyond lieutenant? If I had spent my career in some support role that didn't carry the same prestige?" He looked uncomfortable with the question, which was exactly the point I was trying to make. Respect isn't something that should be contingent on rank or social status. It's something that should be extended to family members, regardless of whether their career choices meet your approval or understanding. The problem wasn't that you disrespected an admiral. The problem was that you disrespected your sister-in-law, your children's aunt, a human being who deserved basic courtesy regardless of her professional achievements. Cassandra finally spoke, her voice strained with emotions I couldn't quite identify. "You're right. Of course you're right. But, Rachel, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think—" "Think what?" I interrupted, feeling 17 years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. That I was wasting my life? That I'd never amount to anything? That my choices were somehow less valid than yours because they took me away from Northbridge? She flinched at the directness of my questions, but I wasn't finished. "I tried to share my experiences with you, Cassandra. I called from foreign ports, sent pictures, tried to explain what I was doing and why it mattered. But every conversation turned into a lecture about what I was missing at home, what I should be doing instead, how I was disappointing mom and dad by choosing adventure over responsibility. The words hung between us, like a bridge finally being built across a chasm that had existed for nearly 2 decades. For the first time since arriving in Northbridge, I felt like I was speaking as my authentic self, rather than playing the role of the accommodating younger sister who apologized for her unconventional life choices.
Cassandra unlocked the door, and we stepped into the elegant foyer that had always made me feel underdressed and out of place. But today, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't the poor relation grateful for inclusion in their refined world. I was a flag officer in the United States Navy, someone trusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond the comfortable boundaries of small cities' social hierarchies. The transformation wasn't just in how they saw me, it was in how I finally saw myself. The interior of Cassandra's house had always represented everything I'd supposedly failed to achieve. The perfect furniture arrangements, the carefully curated artwork, the subtle displays of wealth that marked social status in Northbridge's hierarchical society. But walking through her foyer now, I found myself noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The strategic placement of Jonathan's police commendations, the framed certificates from Cassandra's various charity boards, the wedding photos positioned to showcase connections to the city's most prominent families. It was all very deliberate, very calculated to project an image of success and respectability. There was nothing wrong with it, necessarily, but it struck me as exhausting. The constant need to curate one's environment for the approval of others, the careful maintenance of appearances that defined worth through external validation rather than personal satisfaction. My nephew Marcus appeared at the top of the elegant staircase, apparently having heard our voices. At 14, he'd grown considerably since my last visit 18 months ago, shooting up several inches and developing the gangly proportions of teenage growth spurts. But what struck me most was his expression, a mixture of curiosity and wariness that suggested he'd overheard at least part of the confrontation at the train station. "Aunt Rachel?" he said, his voice carrying that particular tone adolescents used when they weren't sure how adults expected them to behave. "Mom said you were coming to visit, but she seemed pretty upset when she left to pick you up." Cassandra's face tightened with embarrassment. The last thing she wanted was for her son to witness the family drama that had just exploded so publicly. Marcus had always known me as the distant aunt who sent interesting postcards from exotic locations but rarely appeared for important family events. From his perspective, I was probably more myth than reality, a family member whose absence was explained in vague terms about military obligations that meant nothing to a teenage boy growing up in suburban comfort. "Marcus," Cassandra said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining normal family dynamics, "why don't you go finish your homework while your father and I talk with Aunt Rachel?" But Marcus was 14, old enough to sense adult tension and curious enough to want answers. "Is everything okay? You guys seem really weird right now." Jonathan cleared his throat, clearly struggling with how to explain what had just happened. As a police officer, he was accustomed to dealing with family conflicts, but this situation fell far outside his usual professional experience. How do you tell your teenage son that his mother had just publicly assaulted a flag officer in the United States Navy? How do you explain that everything the family had believed about a relative was completely wrong? "Son," Jonathan began carefully, "we've just learned some information about your Aunt Rachel's career that we hadn't fully understood before. It turns out she's achieved some very significant accomplishments in the Navy." Marcus looked at me with renewed interest. "Like, what kind of accomplishments? Are you like a captain or something?" The innocence of the question hit me with unexpected force. Marcus literally had no frame of reference for what I'd achieved because no one had ever bothered to explain it to him. He knew I was in the Navy, but the specifics of my rank, my responsibilities, my actual role in national defense had been filtered through his parents' dismissive attitude toward my career choices. "Actually," I said, meeting his gaze directly,
I was just promoted to Admiral. It means I'll be commanding naval operations in the Pacific Ocean, working with ships and personnel from several different countries to maintain security in some very important shipping lanes. Marcus's eyes widened with genuine excitement. Admiral? Like, you're in charge of a whole bunch of ships and stuff? Quite a few ships and quite a lot of stuff, I confirmed, unable to suppress a small smile at his enthusiasm. It was refreshing to encounter genuine curiosity rather than the complicated mixture of shock and embarrassment that his parents were struggling to process. "That's so cool," Marcus said, his teenage reserve completely forgotten. "Mom always said you just worked on boats, but being an admiral sounds way more important than that. Can you tell me about some of the places you've been? Have you ever been in any sea battles?" Cassandra's face flushed deeper with each of Marcus's questions. His son's obvious excitement about my career was highlighting just how thoroughly she had minimized my achievements in her family narratives. She'd reduced 17 years of naval service to working on boats, eliminating any possibility that Marcus might develop respect or admiration for his aunt's unconventional path.
Marcus, Cassandra said sharply, that's enough questions for now. Your aunt has had a long journey, and we need to discuss some family matters. But Marcus wasn't easily deterred. Can I see some pictures? Do you have any photos from your ship? What's the biggest ship you've ever commanded? The questions kept coming, each one revealing another gap in his understanding of what I'd actually been doing for the past 17 years. It became increasingly clear that Cassandra hadn't just been dismissive of my career in her conversations with me, she'd actively downplayed my achievements in her discussions with her son, robbing him of the opportunity to take pride in his aunt's accomplishments. "I have some pictures on my phone," I said, pulling out my device and scrolling through photos from the change of command ceremony 2 days earlier. This is the USS Meridian, the destroyer I commanded before my promotion. She's 510 feet long and carries a crew of about 300 officers and sailors. Marcus studied the image with obvious fascination. "You were in charge of all those people? How do you even keep track of everyone?" "It takes a lot of training and very good junior officers," I explained. "But the real challenge isn't managing the people, it's making sure everyone works together effectively when the stakes are high. When you're responsible for a vessel worth $2 billion and hundreds of lives, every decision matters." $2 billion. The figure seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Jonathan's annual police budget for the entire city of Northbridge was probably less than $10 million. The single vessel I had commanded represented more financial responsibility than he would handle in several lifetimes of municipal law enforcement. But it was Marcus's reaction that cut deepest. "Mom?" he said, turning to Cassandra with something approaching accusation in his young voice. "Why didn't you ever tell me Aunt Rachel was in charge of stuff like this? This is awesome. She's like a real military hero or something." The word hero seemed to hit Cassandra like a physical blow. She'd spent years positioning herself as the family's success story, the daughter who'd made the right choices and achieved the kind of respectability that parents could brag about to their friends. But faced with her son's obvious admiration for achievements she'd never bothered to understand, she was being forced to confront the possibility that she'd been wrong about more than just my career trajectory. "I didn't realize," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual confident authority. "I honestly didn't understand the scope of what she was doing." It was the closest thing to an admission of error that I'd ever heard from my sister, but it raised uncomfortable questions about willful ignorance versus genuine misunderstanding. How much of her dismissive attitude toward my career had been based on actual lack of information, and how much had been rooted in a need to maintain her own position as the family's success story? Jonathan was watching this exchange with obvious discomfort, clearly recognizing that his wife's credibility was being challenged by their own son's enthusiasm. As a law enforcement officer, he understood the importance of accurate information and honest assessment of facts. What he was witnessing was a fundamental breakdown in the family narrative that had shaped their household for years. "Marcus," I said, sensing the growing tension between mother and son, "your mom had a lot of responsibilities raising you and managing your father's career. It's easy to lose track of details about people who are far away most of the time." The diplomatic response was intended to diffuse the immediate conflict, but Marcus was too perceptive to accept such a simple explanation. "But, Aunt Rachel, if you're an admiral, that means you're really important, right? Like, important enough that people should know about it?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the central issue that had just been exposed in the most public way possible. Yes, my achievements were significant enough that they should have been acknowledged and understood by my family. Yes, my career represented accomplishments worthy of respect and recognition. And yes, the casual dismissal I had accepted for 17 years had been fundamentally wrong. But acknowledging that truth meant confronting some very uncomfortable realities about how family dynamics had been shaped by assumptions, prejudices, and a hierarchy of values that placed conventional success above service to something larger than oneself. The transformation that had begun at Union Central Station was continuing here in Cassandra's perfectly appointed living room, but now it included the next generation, a teenage boy who was beginning to understand that adult perspectives weren't always accurate or fair. The afternoon light streaming through Cassandra's perfectly positioned windows cast long shadows across her living room as Marcus continued peppering me with questions about naval operations, completely oblivious to the mounting tension between his parents. His genuine fascination with my career stood in contrast to the years of dismissive comments I had endured from the adults in his life. "So, when you're commanding all these ships, do you ever have to make decisions about fighting? Like actual combat?"
The question touched on classified operations I couldn't discuss in detail, but I could see the hunger for real information in his eyes, a teenage boy's natural curiosity about adventure and purpose that had been systematically discouraged by parents who preferred safe, conventional narratives. Sometimes naval commanders have to make very difficult decisions about protecting American interests and keeping international shipping lanes safe, I said carefully. The goal is always to prevent conflicts rather than start them, but that requires showing strength and resolve when necessary. Cassandra shifted uncomfortably on her pristine sofa, clearly disturbed by this conversation between her son and the sister she'd worked so hard to diminish in his eyes. But what could she say now? That she'd preferred Marcus to see his aunt as a failure rather than as someone who dedicated her life to protecting the freedoms he took for granted? My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and I glanced at the display with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Admiral Patricia Hawthorne's name appeared on the screen, along with her official Pentagon extension. This wasn't a social call. "I need to take this," I said, standing and moving toward the large windows overlooking Cassandra's manicured backyard. "Admiral Hawthorne, good afternoon." "Rachel," came the familiar voice of my mentor and one of the most respected officers in the modern Navy. "I've been hearing some interesting reports about your current location. Something about an impromptu recognition ceremony at a civilian train station. Word traveled fast in military circles, apparently faster than I'd anticipated. Someone at Union Central Station had obviously contacted naval personnel who'd recognized the significance of what they'd witnessed. The informal network that connected military families and veterans across the country was more efficient than any official communication system." "Yes, ma'am," I said, aware that 3 sets of civilian eyes were watching my end of the conversation with varying degrees of interest and anxiety. "I encountered several officers during what was supposed to be a private family visit. The situation became somewhat public." Admiral Hawthorne's laugh was warm but knowing. "I can imagine. The word I'm getting is that your family was surprised to learn about your recent promotion. That must have made for an interesting afternoon." "That's one way to put it, ma'am." "Rachel, I'm calling because there's been a development with your new assignment timeline. The situation in the South China Sea is escalating faster than our original projections suggest. We're going to need you in San Diego by Thursday for preliminary briefings with Pacific Fleet Command. Thursday? That was 5 days earlier than my original reporting date, which meant my time in Northbridge was being cut from a planned week to less than 48 hours. Under normal circumstances, this would have been disappointing news. Today, given what had transpired, it felt almost like a reprieve. I understand, ma'am. I'll make the necessary arrangements. There's something else, Admiral Hawthorne continued, her tone shifting to the more serious register she used for sensitive information. The Chinese Navy has been conducting aggressive patrols near the Senkaku Islands, and our Japanese allies are requesting increased American naval presence. Your first assignment as Pacific Fleet Liaison is going to involve some very delicate diplomatic coordination. The Senkaku Islands, a cluster of uninhabited rocks in the East China Sea that had become a flashpoint for territorial disputes between Japan and China. American naval operations in those waters required the kind of strategic thinking and cultural sensitivity that could prevent regional conflicts from escalating into international crises. I'll be ready, ma'am. I know you will. Give my regards to your family, Rachel. I hope they're appropriately proud of what you've accomplished. The call ended, leaving me staring out at Cassandra's suburban backyard while processing the implications of what I just learned. My new assignment wasn't just prestigious, it was strategically critical to maintaining peace in one of the world's most contested maritime regions. The decisions I would make in the coming months could directly impact the relationship between 3 major Pacific powers and the security of shipping lanes that carried trillions of dollars in international trade. Was that someone important? Marcus asked as I returned to my seat, his teenage instincts picking up on the formal tone of the conversation. That was Admiral Hawthorne, I said, noting that Cassandra's eyebrows rose at the mention of another admiral. She's one of the most senior officers in the Navy. She was calling about my new assignment. What kind of assignment? I considered how much detail to share, settling on the broadest possible outline. I'll be coordinating naval operations with our allied nations in the Pacific, particularly Japan and South Korea. It involves maintaining security in some very important shipping lanes while managing some complex international relationships. The sanitized description didn't begin to capture the real complexity of the assignment, but it was enough to convey the scope of responsibility involved. I would be representing American naval power in negotiations with foreign admirals, making operational decisions that affected thousands of personnel across multiple fleets, and serving as a direct liaison between the Pentagon and allied governments. Marcus leaned forward with obvious excitement. So, you'll be like a diplomat, but with battleships.
Something like that, I agreed, charmed by his enthusiasm despite the awkwardness of the family situation. Though we call them destroyers and cruisers now. Battleships are mostly museum pieces these days. That's the coolest job ever, Marcus declared with the absolute certainty that only teenagers could muster. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me Aunt Rachel had such an awesome career? I could have been bragging about this to my friends for years. Cassandra's face went through several color changes as she struggled to respond to her son's innocent question. How could she explain that she'd systematically minimized her sister's achievements because they didn't fit her narrow definition of success? How could she admit that she'd robbed her own son of the opportunity to take pride in his aunt's service to their country? I guess I didn't fully understand, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I made assumptions about what Rachel was doing without really listening to what she was trying to tell us. It was the most honest admission she'd made since my arrival, and it opened a door to a conversation that was long overdue. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how many other family narratives had been shaped by similar assumptions and prejudices. The thing is, I said, choosing my words carefully, I tried to share my experiences over the years. I sent emails about ports I'd visited, photos from ceremonies and exercises, updates about promotions and new assignments. But every time I called or visited, the conversation seemed to turn to what I was missing here at home, rather than what I was accomplishing in my career. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, clearly remembering conversations where he'd participated in dismissing my boat job as somehow less significant than his police work. The comparison between municipal law enforcement and international naval operations was becoming increasingly stark as more details about my actual responsibilities emerged. "I remember some of those calls," Marcus said suddenly. "You guys would get off the phone with Aunt Rachel and talk about how she was wasting her education, how she could have been doing something important instead of floating around the ocean. I always wondered what was so bad about the Navy." The innocent observation from a 14-year-old boy carried more devastating accuracy than any adult criticism could have managed. Marcus had witnessed years of family conversations where his aunt's service was characterized as wasteful and unimportant, where her absence from family events was attributed to selfish choices rather than professional obligations. But he'd also heard those conversations with the clear perception of someone too young to have developed adult prejudices about what constituted valuable work. From his perspective, naval service sounded adventurous and meaningful, not like the failure his parents had portrayed it to be. "Marcus," Cassandra said, her voice tight with embarrassment, suggesting that he was treading into territory that adults preferred to leave unexplored. "No, Mom," he interrupted, displaying a backbone I'd never seen from him before. "This is important. Aunt Rachel is like a real hero, and you made her sound like some kind of loser who couldn't get her life together. That's not fair, and it's not true." The word hero seemed to reverberate through the room with uncomfortable intensity. I had never thought of myself in those terms. Military service was simply what I'd chosen to do with my life, a calling that provided purpose and meaning in ways that civilian careers never could have. But hearing it from Marcus, spoken with the honest admiration of someone too young to have developed cynicism about military service, forced me to consider my own accomplishments from a different perspective.
Marcus is right, I said finally, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of the past few hours. And that's exactly the problem we need to address. Not just the misunderstanding about my career, but the underlying assumptions that made those misunderstandings possible. I stood up and walked to the large windows overlooking their backyard, gathering my thoughts before continuing. The view was quintessentially suburban. Perfectly maintained grass, carefully arranged flower beds, a swing set that Marcus had outgrown but that remained as a symbol of successful family life. It was lovely in its own way, but it represented such a narrow slice of human experience. "Cassandra," I said, turning back to face my sister, "I need you to understand something that goes beyond military rank or professional achievements. For 17 years, you've treated me as if my choices were somehow less valid than yours simply because they didn't conform to your definition of success. You've dismissed my service as playing with boats, while building your identity around managing Jonathan's police career and organizing charity luncheons." Cassandra's face flushed, but I wasn't finished. "There's nothing wrong with the life you've chosen. Marriage, family, community involvement, these are valuable contributions to society, but they're not the only valuable contributions. When you characterize military service as somehow less important than local politics or social climbing, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting everyone who's chosen to serve something larger than their immediate community." Jonathan finally looked up from his hands, his expression troubled. "Rachel, we never meant to minimize your service. It's just that we didn't understand the scope of what you were doing. You never really explained." "I tried to explain," I interrupted, feeling 17 years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. Every phone call, every email, every rare visit home, I tried to share my experiences, to help you understand what naval service meant to me and why it mattered. But every conversation became a lecture about what I was missing at home, what I should be doing instead, how disappointed Mom and Dad were in my choices. The mention of our parents brought a shadow across Cassandra's face. Thomas and Eleanor Montgomery had died in a car accident 3 years ago, taking with them any chance for reconciliation or understanding about my career path.
Their final conversations with me had been filled with the same gentle disappointment that had characterized their reaction to my life choices since high school. "They were proud of you," Cassandra said quietly. "Mom kept newspaper clippings about naval operations, trying to figure out if you might have been involved. She just never knew how to bridge the gap between your world and ours." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Our mother had been following my career from a distance, collecting fragments of information about military operations that might have involved her daughter. She'd been trying to understand, in her own limited way, but had never found a way to express that interest directly. "Why didn't you tell me that before?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because she made me promise not to," Cassandra admitted, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She was afraid you'd think she was being intrusive or trying to interfere with your independence. She knew you'd chosen a life that took you away from us, and she didn't want to make you feel guilty about it." The complexity of family love suddenly revealed itself in all its painful contradiction. Our parents had been proud but afraid to show it, supportive but uncertain how to express that support, loving but convinced that their love might be unwelcome or burdensome. They died without ever having the conversation that might have bridged the gap between their world and mine. "God," I said, sinking back into my chair as the full weight of these revelations settled over me. "We've all been so stupid about this. So unnecessarily stupid." Marcus, who'd been listening to this exchange with the fascination of someone watching adult illusions crumble in real time, spoke up with surprising wisdom. "It's not too late, though, right? I mean, you guys can fix this now that everything's out in the open. Aunt Rachel is going to be around for a while, isn't she?" The announcement seemed to deflate some of the hope that had been building in the room. 2 days wasn't enough time to repair the damage that had been done, to build the kind of understanding that should have existed all along, or to establish the foundation for a healthier relationship going forward. But Jonathan surprised me by leaning forward with an expression of genuine determination. "Then we make the most of those 2 days," he said firmly. "No more assumptions, no more polite deflections, no more talking around the real issues. If we're going to fix this, we do it honestly and completely."
Cassandra nodded slowly, wiping away tears that had been threatening to fall since Marcus's first challenging questions. "I want to understand, Rachel. I really do. I want to know about your career, your responsibilities, what your life has actually been like all these years. Not the sanitized version I've been hearing, but the real story." "And I want to tell it," I replied, feeling something inside me relax for the first time since stepping off the train. All of it, the good and the difficult, the achievements and the sacrifices, the reasons why I've stayed away, and the reasons why I've always wanted to come home. Marcus clapped his hands together with teenage enthusiasm. "This is going to be the best 2 days ever. It's like getting to know a whole new family member, except she's been here the whole time." His excitement was infectious, and despite the emotional complexity of the situation, I found myself smiling for the first time since arriving in Northbridge. Maybe 2 days wasn't enough time to fix everything, but it might be enough time to start building something new and better from the wreckage of our old assumptions. The confrontation that had begun so painfully at Union Central Station was evolving into something I hadn't expected, an opportunity for genuine connection, honest communication, and the possibility of a family relationship based on mutual respect rather than convenient fiction. But first, we had to navigate the delicate process of dismantling 17 years of carefully constructed misunderstandings, one uncomfortable truth at a time. The decision to spend the evening sharing my real story felt both liberating and terrifying. For 17 years, I'd protected my family from the harsh realities of military service, sanitizing my experiences to avoid conversations about danger, sacrifice, and the moral complexities of naval operations in contested waters. But Marcus's genuine curiosity and Cassandra's newfound willingness to listen had created an opening for honesty that hadn't existed since I'd left home at 18.
Let me show you something, I said, pulling out my laptop and connecting it to their large-screen television. These are photos from the past 5 years of operations, the kind of things I've never shared because I thought you wouldn't be interested. The first image that appeared was from the USS Meridian during a joint exercise with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. 6 destroyers from 3 different nations were arranged in perfect formation, their gray hulls cutting through Pacific swells under a dramatic sunset sky. The scale and precision of the operation was immediately apparent, even to civilian eyes. "My God," Cassandra whispered, leaning forward to study the image. "How many people are involved in something like this?" "About 1,800 sailors and officers across all the vessels, plus support crews, logistics personnel, intelligence analysts, and diplomatic liaisons. When you're coordinating multinational operations, every decision affects thousands of people and millions of dollars in equipment." Marcus pointed at one of the ships in the formation. "Which one's yours?" "The lead destroyer," I said, highlighting the vessel with a laser pointer I'd retrieved from my laptop bag. "That's the Meridian. When you're commanding the lead vessel in a formation like this, you're responsible not just for your own crew, but for the safe execution of the entire exercise." Jonathan studied the image with professional interest. "The coordination required for something like this must be incredible. In police work, managing a multi-agency operation with 50 officers is complex enough. This looks like it involves thousands of moving parts." "Exactly," I confirmed, pleased by his genuine engagement with the material. "And that's during peacetime training exercises. When tensions are high and you're operating in contested waters, the complexity increases exponentially." I advanced through more photos. The Meridian navigating through a typhoon in the South China Sea, crew members conducting humanitarian aid operations in the Philippines, formal ceremonies with foreign naval officers whose uniforms represented some of the world's most powerful maritime forces. Each image told a story of responsibility, skill, and dedication that bore no resemblance to the casual dismissals my family had offered over the years. But it was the next photo that truly captured their attention. The image showed me in full dress uniform standing between the Secretary of the Navy and a Japanese admiral during a ceremony in Tokyo Bay. The formal nature of the event was unmistakable, as was the level of protocol and international significance represented by the gathering. "When was this taken?" Cassandra asked, her voice carrying a note of awe that I'd never heard when she discussed my career. 18 months ago, I replied. "We were signing agreements for expanded naval cooperation in response to increasing tensions with North Korea. The ceremony took place aboard the Japanese flagship, with representatives from 7 different allied nations." "You were part of international treaty negotiations?" Jonathan asked, his understanding of governmental authority helping him grasp the significance of what he was seeing. "I was leading the American naval delegation," I clarified. "The agreements we signed that day established new protocols for joint patrols, shared intelligence operations, and coordinated responses to maritime threats throughout the region." Marcus leaned back in his chair with obvious amazement. "So you were basically making decisions about war and peace with other countries? That's one way to put it, though the goal is always to prevent conflicts through strength and diplomacy rather than to start them."
I continued through the presentation, sharing photos from Arctic operations where we'd asserted American territorial claims, images from anti-piracy missions off the coast of Somalia, and documentation of humanitarian missions that had saved thousands of lives during natural disasters. Each photo represented months or years of training, planning, and execution by highly skilled professionals operating some of the most sophisticated military equipment ever created. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when I showed them a video from my change of command ceremony 18 months earlier. The footage, shot by the Navy's Public Affairs Office, captured the formal transfer of authority as I assumed command of the USS Meridian from my predecessor. "I, Commander Rachel Montgomery, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic," my voice carried clearly through their living room sound system, "that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me according to regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So help me God. The formal oath, delivered before hundreds of assembled officers and crew members, carried a weight and solemnity that civilian ceremonies rarely matched. This wasn't just a job promotion. It was the assumption of sacred responsibilities that extended far beyond personal advancement or professional achievement. Cassandra was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she watched her sister command the respect and attention of hundreds of military professionals. "I had no idea," she whispered. "Rachel, I had absolutely no idea what you were doing, what any of this meant." "How could you have known?" I replied, pausing the video. "I never showed you any of this. I kept my military life completely separate from my family life, thinking I was protecting you from the complexity you wouldn't want to deal with. But what I was really doing was protecting myself from the possibility that you might not find it impressive or meaningful." The admission hung in the air between us, revealing another layer of the communication breakdown that had characterized our relationship for so long. I'd been as complicit in the misunderstanding as they had been, choosing silence over the risk of disappointment, professional isolation over the possibility of family pride. "But why?" Marcus asked with teenage directness. "Why wouldn't you want your family to know about all this awesome stuff you were doing?" The question forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own insecurities and assumptions. "Because," I said slowly, "I was afraid that even if I explained it all, you might still think I was wasting my potential. I was afraid that no matter what I achieved in the Navy, it would never measure up to the conventional success that Mom and Dad wanted for their daughters." Jonathan shook his head firmly. "Rachel, any parent would be proud to have a daughter who achieved what you have achieved. The problem wasn't that we wouldn't have been proud. The problem was that we never understood what there was to be proud of." But Cassandra was struggling with a more complex realization. "I think," she said hesitantly, "I think I was threatened by your choices. Not because they were wrong, but because they were so different from my own. You chose adventure and service over security and conventional success, and part of me always wondered if that made you braver than I was." The vulnerability in her admission surprised me. Cassandra had always projected absolute confidence in her life choices, never showing doubt or uncertainty about the path she'd chosen. But beneath that confidence, it seemed, had been an awareness that her sister had chosen the more challenging road, had risked more, and achieved something that couldn't be measured in traditional terms of suburban success. "You weren't less brave," I told her honestly. "You made different choices. Choices that were right for your temperament and your values. There's nothing wrong with wanting stability and community connection, but there's also nothing wrong with choosing service and adventure, even when it means sacrificing some conventional measures of success." Marcus, who'd been listening to this exchange with obvious fascination, suddenly sat up straighter. "Wait, does this mean I can tell my friends that my aunt is like a real military hero? Because that would be so cool." The simple enthusiasm in his voice reminded me why this conversation mattered beyond just family harmony. Marcus represented the next generation, someone who could grow up understanding that service came in many forms, that success could be measured by more than salary and social status, that choosing a challenging path was worthy of respect rather than pity. "Yes," I said, meeting his excited gaze, "you can tell your friends that your aunt is an admiral in the United States Navy, and you can be proud of that because it represents years of hard work, difficult decisions, and dedication to something larger than personal advancement." But as I said the words, I was acutely aware that our time for building this new understanding was already running short. In less than 48 hours, I would be boarding a plane to San Diego and the next phase of my career, leaving behind a family relationship that was just beginning to find solid ground.
The real test would be whether the foundation we were building in these intensive conversations could survive the geographical distance and time pressures that had undermined our connection for so many years.
The next morning brought a clarity to our situation that the emotional intensity of the previous evening had obscured. I woke early in Cassandra's guest room, a space I was finally occupying as it had originally been intended, and found myself thinking about the practical implications of everything that had transpired. The revelation of my rank and responsibilities had shifted our family dynamic in ways that would require ongoing navigation, not just a single night of honest conversation. Downstairs, I discovered that Cassandra had been awake even earlier, preparing what appeared to be a formal breakfast with the kind of attention to detail she usually reserved for entertaining important guests. The table was set with her best china, fresh flowers had been arranged as a centerpiece, and the smell of homemade biscuits filled the kitchen with domestic warmth. "I wanted to do something special," she explained when she saw my surprised expression. "Yesterday, I treated you like an inconvenience. Today, I want to treat you like the honored guest you should have been from the beginning." The gesture was meaningful, but it also highlighted one of the challenges we faced going forward. I didn't want to be treated as an honored guest in my own family. I wanted to be treated as a sister who happened to have achieved professional success in a field they were finally learning to understand and respect. "Cassandra," I said gently, "this is lovely, but you don't need to overcompensate. I just want us to find a normal way to relate to each other that acknowledges who we both are without either dismissing my achievements or putting them on a pedestal." She paused in her breakfast preparations, considering my words with the serious attention she'd been giving to everything I said since the confrontation at Union Central Station. "You're right. I think I'm struggling to find the right balance. For so long, I've either been dismissive or completely ignorant about your career. Now that I understand the scope of what you've accomplished, I'm not sure how to act normally around you." It was an honest admission that captured the complexity of our situation. Relationships couldn't be rebuilt overnight, especially when they'd been founded on fundamental misunderstandings about each other's lives and values. We were essentially starting from scratch, trying to establish a connection between two adults who'd grown and changed considerably during the years of emotional distance. Jonathan appeared in the kitchen dressed for work, his police uniform crisp and professional. But his demeanor toward me had undergone a subtle transformation since yesterday's revelations. The casual dismissiveness that had characterized his previous interactions with me had been replaced with the more formal respect that felt almost uncomfortable in its intensity. "Admiral," he said, offering a slight nod that was almost military in its precision. "I hope you slept well." I nearly winced at the formal address. "Jonathan, please, I'm still Rachel, still your sister-in-law. The rank doesn't change our family relationship." But I could see him struggling with the same challenge Cassandra was facing: how to acknowledge my professional achievements without letting them completely overshadow the personal connection we were trying to rebuild. It was particularly difficult for him as a law enforcement officer who understood hierarchical authority structures and the respect due to high-ranking military personnel. Marcus bounded into the kitchen with teenage energy, apparently untroubled by the complexities that were confusing his parents. "Morning, Admiral Aunt Rachel," he said with a grin that suggested he was enjoying the awkwardness his parents were experiencing. "Just Aunt Rachel will be fine," I told him, though I appreciated his obvious pride in my rank. "Save the formal address for when you're trying to impress your friends." "Oh, I'm definitely doing that," he confirmed cheerfully. "Jake Morrison is always bragging about how his uncle is a state trooper. Wait until he hears about my Admiral Aunt." The casual confidence with which he discussed sharing my achievements stood in contrast to the years of family secrecy that had characterized my career. Marcus represented a new generation of family understanding, someone who could grow up knowing that service came in many forms and that choosing a challenging path was worthy of celebration rather than quiet embarrassment. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and I glanced at the screen to see a notification from Captain Walsh, the officer who'd been present during yesterday's scene at the train station.
The message was brief but significant. Admiral, thought you should know, word of yesterday's incident has reached some very high levels. You may be receiving official communications soon. Official communications. That could mean anything from congratulations to concerns about security protocols being compromised during a public confrontation. Military personnel at flag rank are expected to maintain certain standards of conduct and operational security, even during personal leave. The public nature of yesterday's revelation could potentially raise questions about my judgment or discretion. I excused myself from the breakfast table and stepped onto Cassandra's back patio to return Walsh's call. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of suburban lawns and the distant sound of commuter traffic, beginning the daily ritual of American productivity. "Captain Walsh," I said when he answered, "I received your message. What kind of official communications should I be expecting?"
Nothing negative, ma'am, he assured me quickly, but the video footage from Union Central Station has been circulating through military social media channels. Someone posted it with the caption, "Family finally learns what their daughter really does for a living." It's gone viral within military communities. Viral. The word carried implications I hadn't considered when the confrontation was unfolding yesterday. Modern technology meant that personal moments could become public property within hours, especially when they involved dramatic revelations about military service that resonated with countless families who'd experienced similar misunderstandings. The good news, Walsh continued, is that the response has been overwhelmingly positive. Military families are sharing their own stories about civilian relatives who never understood their service. It's become a rallying point for conversations about the civilian-military divide and the importance of recognizing service members' contributions. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family's private dysfunction had accidentally become a symbol for broader social issues about how military service was understood and valued in civilian communities. The personal had become political, and my individual story was now part of a larger narrative about respect, recognition, and the complexity of modern American civil-military relations. "There's more, ma'am," Walsh said. "Admiral Hawthorne wants to speak with you this afternoon about incorporating your experience into the Navy's family outreach programs. Apparently, the Joint Chiefs are interested in using your story as part of broader initiatives to improve understanding between military and civilian communities." The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest level of military leadership in the United States, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense and the President. The fact that my personal family drama had reached their attention suggested that the implications extended far beyond individual embarrassment or recognition. "I understand, Captain. Please let Admiral Hawthorne know I'll be available for her call." As I ended the conversation and returned to Cassandra's kitchen, I found myself facing yet another layer of complexity in an already complicated situation. My family reconciliation had accidentally become a public example of broader social issues, which meant that our private process of rebuilding relationships would now take place under the scrutiny of military and civilian communities who were watching to see how such situations could be resolved. But perhaps that pressure could also provide motivation for making our reconciliation genuine and lasting. If our story was going to inspire other families to bridge similar gaps in understanding, we had a responsibility to demonstrate that such bridges could actually be built and maintained over time. "Everything okay?" Cassandra asked when I rejoined them at the breakfast table, noting the serious expression I was probably wearing. "It's complicated," I replied, then caught myself falling back into the old pattern of vague deflection. "Actually, let me be completely honest with you about what's happening. Yesterday's confrontation was recorded by bystanders and has become a widely shared video in military communities. People are responding to it as an example of how military families often struggle with understanding and recognition." Marcus looked up from his breakfast with obvious excitement. "You mean we're famous?"
In certain circles, apparently. But more importantly, it means that how we handle rebuilding our relationship will be watched by people who are dealing with similar challenges in their own families. Cassandra set down her coffee cup with a thoughtful expression. So we have an opportunity to demonstrate that these kinds of misunderstandings can be resolved, that families can learn to appreciate and support each other even when they've been getting it wrong for years. Exactly, I said, appreciating her quick understanding of the broader implications. If we can figure out how to maintain genuine connection despite geographical distance and different life experiences, we might provide a model for other families facing similar challenges. Jonathan nodded slowly. That's actually a significant responsibility, but also an opportunity to make something positive come from all the years of missed understanding. The conversation that followed over breakfast was different from the emotional revelations of the previous evening. Instead of focusing on past mistakes and missed opportunities, we began discussing practical strategies for maintaining connection going forward. How often should we communicate? What kinds of information should I share about my assignments? And how could they better understand the context and significance of my work? These were the mundane but crucial details that would determine whether our reconciliation survived the test of time and distance, or whether it would fade like so many good intentions once the emotional intensity of the moment passed. But as I looked around the breakfast table at my sister, my brother-in-law, and my nephew, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine optimism about our family's future together. The call from Admiral Hawthorne came precisely at 1400, as military punctuality dictated. I had positioned myself in Cassandra's home office, surrounded by the trappings of her carefully curated professional life, framed certificates from various charity boards, photos from fundraising galas, and the kind of motivational artwork that filled the offices of successful suburban professionals. The irony of conducting a Pentagon-level conversation from this quintessentially civilian space wasn't lost on me. Rachel, Admiral Hawthorne's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to moving naval assets across global theaters. I've been reviewing the footage from yesterday's incident, and I want you to understand the broader implications of what occurred.
Yes, ma'am, I replied, settling into the leather chair that Cassandra used for managing her various social and charitable obligations. Captain Walsh briefed me on the viral nature of the video within military communities. It goes beyond social media circulation, Admiral Hawthorne continued. The Secretary of the Navy has been briefed, and there's interest at the highest levels of DoD leadership. Your situation has crystallized something that military family support organizations have been struggling to address for decades: the fundamental disconnect between civilian understanding and military reality. Through the office window, I could see Marcus shooting basketball in the driveway, his movements carrying the casual confidence of a teenager who just discovered that his family was more interesting than he'd previously understood. The normalcy of the suburban scene provided a stark contrast to the conversation about Pentagon-level policy implications taking place just a few feet away. Ma'am, what kind of interest are we discussing? The Joint Chiefs want to incorporate your experience into a broader initiative addressing civilian-military relations. Specifically, they're interested in developing family education programs that help civilian relatives understand the scope and significance of modern military service. Your story provides a perfect case study: a flag officer whose own family was unaware of her achievements and responsibilities. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a heavy cloak. My personal family dysfunction was being transformed into a policy tool, a teaching example for addressing broader social issues. While the potential positive impact was obvious, the loss of privacy and the pressure to represent something larger than my individual experience felt overwhelming. Admiral, I'm honored by the confidence, but I need to point out that my family situation is still very much in progress. We're rebuilding relationships that were damaged by years of misunderstanding. I'm not sure we're ready to serve as an example for others when we're still figuring things out ourselves. Admiral Hawthorne's laugh carried warmth and understanding. Rachel, that's exactly why your situation is so valuable.
Most military families are dealing with ongoing challenges, not perfect solutions. The fact that you're working through these issues in real time with genuine commitment from all parties makes your experience more relevant than some sanitized success story. From downstairs came the sound of Cassandra and Jonathan discussing dinner plans, their voices carrying the comfortable rhythm of a long-established marriage navigating domestic logistics. But there was something different in their tone now. A subtle acknowledgement that their household routine had been permanently altered by the presence of someone whose responsibilities extended far beyond their suburban boundaries. There's another aspect to this, Admiral Hawthorne continued. Your new Pacific assignment puts you in one of the most strategically critical positions in the modern Navy. The decisions you'll be making over the next few years could directly impact American relationships with our most important allies and potentially prevent conflicts that could destabilize the entire region. The casual mention of preventing international conflicts served as a reminder of why yesterday's revelations had been so shocking to my family. The gap between playing with boats and preventing international conflicts was so vast that it might as well have been measured in different units of human experience entirely. Given that level of responsibility, Admiral Hawthorne continued, having a strong support system becomes not just personally important, but strategically significant. Officers operating at your level need to be confident that their families understand and support their mission. The distraction of unresolved family tensions can impact decision-making in ways that affect thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. It was a diplomatic way of saying that my family reconciliation wasn't just personally beneficial, it was professionally necessary. Flag officers couldn't afford to have their judgment clouded by domestic concerns when making decisions about international naval operations. I understand, ma'am. And I believe we're making genuine progress toward that kind of understanding and support. Good, because there's one more thing you need to know. The President briefed on your new assignment and specifically requested updates on your family situation. The White House is very interested in successful models for civilian-military integration, especially as we face increasing tensions in the Pacific theater. The President, the Commander-in-Chief of all American military forces, was personally aware of my family dynamics and their potential impact on my effectiveness as a Pacific Fleet commander. The surreal nature of this information took a moment to fully process. Ma'am, I'm not sure how to respond to that level of attention. Respond by continuing to do what you've been doing, serving with distinction while building the kind of family support that allows you to focus completely on your mission responsibilities. And Rachel, don't let the high-level attention pressure you into making your reconciliation more complicated than it needs to be. At the end of the day, this is about a sister who finally understands her siblings' achievements and a family learning to communicate more effectively. After the call ended, I sat in Cassandra's office for a few minutes, processing the implications of everything I'd learned. My personal story had become a matter of national security interest. My family relationships were now relevant to American strategic policy in the Pacific, and my success or failure in rebuilding these connections could impact military family support programs for years to come.
But beneath all the high-level implications and policy considerations, the fundamental truth remained simple. I was a daughter and sister who wanted her family to understand and respect her life choices, and they were family members who were finally ready to provide that understanding and respect. When I returned to the main floor of the house, I found Cassandra, Jonathan, and Marcus engaged in animated discussion about dinner plans that apparently involved inviting several neighbors to meet their famous relative. The casual way they were incorporating my presence into their social life suggested a level of acceptance and pride that had been completely absent during my previous visits. "Admiral Aunt Rachel," Marcus called out when he saw me. "Mom's inviting the Hendersons and the Clarks over for dinner tomorrow night so you can tell them about your adventures before you leave for California. Is that okay?" The easy integration of my military identity into their suburban social life represented a fundamental shift from the years of careful omission and diplomatic deflection that had characterized my family relationships. They were no longer hiding my career or minimizing my achievements. They were celebrating them openly and sharing them with their community. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, genuinely touched by their enthusiasm. Though I should warn you that most of my adventures are classified, so I'll have to stick to general stories about interesting ports and international cooperation. That's still way cooler than anything the Hendersons have to talk about, Cassandra said, with a smile that carried genuine affection, rather than the strained politeness that had marked our previous interactions. As we gathered around their kitchen table for our final family dinner before my departure, I realized that the transformation that had begun with such pain and public embarrassment at Union Central Station had evolved into something neither of us could have anticipated. We hadn't just resolved a misunderstanding, we'd discovered the possibility of genuine connection based on mutual respect and honest communication. The slap that had started this entire crisis had become the catalyst for the strongest family relationships I'd experienced since leaving home at 18. Sometimes it seemed the most destructive moments could become the foundation for building something better than had existed before. And as I looked around the table at my sister, her husband, and their son, all of them finally seeing me as I truly was, rather than as they'd assumed me to be, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the painful honesty that had made this understanding possible. Tomorrow, I would board a plane for San Diego and the most important assignment of my naval career. But for the first time in 17 years, I would be leaving home with the absolute confidence that my family understood, respected, and supported the path I had chosen. The woman who had been slapped at Union Central Station was gone. In her place stood Admiral Rachel Montgomery, supported by a family who finally knew exactly who she was and what she represented, both to them and to the nation she had sworn to serve.